You have watched every atheist debate on the internet and learned every argument and counter-argument that exists. You have inhaled every logic video and read every Hitchens book. And if a believer would throw his challenge at you, you could defeat him with your eyes closed. Or could you? Let's find out. Before starting, I owe an apology. Anti-sleeper, Patreons, I am sorry, but I could not continue the exorcism series and I could not film this month. Partly because we had no time, because there was a lot to do, and partly because I was limping after piercing my foot on a rusty nail. Smart me. I'll hopefully get back to filming next month, and for now, I'm just really sorry. But at least I don't let you hang, I make another video instead. A few days ago, a friend of mine directed me to a very intriguing discussion on an atheist forum that I would like to share with you. Let us see how good our fellow atheists did, and if we could maybe learn a thing or two from these exchanges.
Burden of proof is on the one making the positive claim. Lack of belief is not a claim.
Well, no. Lack of belief is a claim. If you say you lack the belief in something, you claim that you lack a belief. You can argue that it's not a positive claim, but it is a claim.
There is no compelling, falsifiable evidence for the existence of any god of religion. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
So far, so good. The author of these posts, let's call him Fishy. Fishy the atheist. Fishy here lays down his way of thinking, stating that if you assert something without giving me evidence for it, then I don't have to believe you. Of course, I would add compelling in front of evidence if I was in his shoes, not just evidence, because there is an awful lot of shoddy evidence around there that doesn't really count. But that's just nitpicking.
It's why I can say there is no God without having to prove there is no God. Because such a statement is not making a positive claim. Until you can prove there is a God of religion, I do not need to prove there is no God.
Whoa there, rookie. Hold your horses. If you say there is no God, then you're making an assertion. If your standard is that negative claim doesn't need to be proven, then that assertion of yours doesn't need to be proven. However, if you also state that assertions without evidence can be dismissed, then your assertion that there is no God can, by your own standards, be dismissed as well, without evidence. Your wording was not very well chosen. Now, the idea itself that negative claims cannot be proven or should not be proven is not completely bulletproof itself, obviously, because there are cases where negative claims do have to be proven. For example, if you get stopped by a police officer and you say, I am not drunk, you're making a negative claim. However, you will have to prove it by breathing into a fancy little tube that shows to the officer that there is indeed no alcohol in your breath and you are indeed not drunk. In truth, the burden of proof is not with the person who asserts or denies something, but with the person who wants to convince the other side. If you want to convince the other side that there is a God, then you have the burden of proof on you to prove a God. If you want to convince the other side that there isn't, then the burden of proof is on you to prove that there is not. Now, often what happens is that people who want to convince the other person that, for example, there is no God, do so by pointing out fallacies of the other person. Your story doesn't hold up because this and that reason. But the two is, in a nutshell, you having the burden of proof. You are proving that the claim of the other person is flawed. And the reason for it being like that is very simple. I already believe what I believe, and you already believe what you believe. If I don't care to change your mind, and you don't want to change mine, then there is no need for either of us to provide good arguments or good evidence. We could merely share our opinion and leave it at that. Now, I wouldn't necessarily tell that to the other side, but a smart enough Christian or other religious person will pick up on that, consider your approach special pleading, and just discard your assertion as stupid.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's why unearthed diaries of ordinary people doing ordinary things is valid evidence of the ordinary, but an ordinary book telling of extraordinary claims is not valid evidence of said claims. Because a book written by men is not extraordinary evidence.
Ah, so many good classics. Beautiful. Obviously, by now, most of you have realized that Fishy is basically posting a concatenation of famous atheist catchphrases. And there is no real clear thread going on there. I've just realized that I'm a massive hypocrite. I keep telling people to keep it simple and not throw in fancy words in their arguments, and there I go ahead and use the word concatenating. Well, concatenare comes from Latin con meaning together, catena being a chain, and it basically means chaining together. He chained together phrases. And I deserve some proper shaming for that.
For shame!
Anyway, the idea that ordinary claims can be taken as valid evidence is true in principle, however it is not perfect. If we read in a diary that Betty Ordinary has taken a carriage to the city that day, that's a very mundane claim. However, it would be very different if she wrote that the butler was suddenly in front of the door, screaming at her, completely surrounded by giant flames, as if he had risen from hell itself, and yet there was no fire anywhere else in the room. Well, that would be far, far more questionable, wouldn't it? The problem is that she could have written the city part into the diary to mislead her father and hide an affair. And the butler could have been refilling the lamp oil and accidentally spilled it on himself before stumbling into a candle. And Betty could have entered the room right as he caught fire and the flames spread all over the oil-drenched clothing. So while we can be far more confident about the former case, the carriage to the city, both cases are, in the end, not much more than an eyewitness account, and neither can be taken for granted. Obviously, in this particular case, it is not really that important. But it is something to keep in mind, because if at some point we don't accept eyewitness account as evidence, especially accounts that our counterpart considers mundane, then we would basically sound like a bunch of hypocrites, and bite ourselves in our glorified posterior. Alright, so far so good. Let us see the response.
Burden of proof is the one making the positive claim. Is that applicable on climate change, too? I don't believe in climate change because I have not seen sufficient evidence. Is that applicable to evolution? I haven't seen enough evidence to believe in evolution. Is it applicable to gender issues? I haven't seen evidence for women in men's bodies. Is it applicable to science? I haven't seen evidence that papers are trustworthy or unbiased. In fact, I saw the opposite. Will you stick to your standards and agree with my approach?
As we can see here, the challenger, let's call him Squirrel. Squirrel the challenger. As we can see here, Squirrel is now testing Fishy's claims. His comment can unfortunately be read in two ways. Either Squirrel genuinely shares his belief here, or he talks in hypotheticals and tries to find things that Fishy might believe in and applies Fishy's methodology to them to see if Fishy is consistent. And I like that approach actually. It's very, very clever. He basically tries to poke holes into the words of his opponent. Now, the phrasing unfortunately is rather scruffy. For example, it doesn't quite follow that science is put in question because of its flawed application. Obviously, there is a bit of an issue there with definitions. We do not know how science is defined. I would define it as a method. He might define it as something else. But the actual core point is pretty clear and is well made. Is the assertion that negatives do not need to be proven applicable across the board? Is it Fishy or is it not? And Fishy responds like this.
Burden of proof is on the one making the positive claim. Is that applicable to climate change too? Yes. As such, I have not seen compelling evidence for climate change, at least not to the degree they claim, and certainly not the response measures they want enacted.
So far, Fish is consistent. He also does something very smart, which is sharing his skepticism about climate change with Squirrel. It sort of builds a bridge. Hey, you don't believe in X, I don't believe in X either. We're kind of not that different, are we, see? It generally reduces the hostility and can make the other person far more eager to listen. Obviously, I wouldn't apply that strategy in a dishonest way. Don't say that you believe in flying ostriches if you don't. But if you happen to realize that you share an opinion with your opponent, then in some cases it is helpful to point that out. Well played, Fishy. Now, I won't reply to the entire exchange. At some point, Fishy mentions that this is science, so yes, which quite honestly makes no sense in that place to me. And maybe I would have liked if instead he had defined what science is or asked Squirrel for his definition to clarify the point a bit, but none of these things are really necessary, and all in all, he had a great response. Except of evolution.
Is it applicable to evolution? Yes. I haven't seen enough evidence to believe in evolution. Then you haven't studied it. Proof for evolution is not as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. There is a great deal that goes into it, requiring hundreds, if not thousands of hours to research, if you want to fully understand it all. Here is but a small place you can start. By no means even remotely comprehensive of all the evidence there is.
And then there is a link to Aaron Ra's playlist, which is called Systematic Classification of Life. And I have to say, Fishy, dude, what are you doing? So, first of all, again, Fish is consistent. He says, yes, it applies to evolution too, which is good. However, then he makes a very, very big mistake. He assumes that Squirrel has not studied evolution and writes it down. Now, if you remember, I have previously said that Squirrel could have either shared his beliefs or set up hypotheticals. I don't know. You don't know. And Fishy doesn't know either. Based on what we know so far, it is a moderately safe assumption to think that we are in fact dealing with a creationist. But as we saw with Betty not so long ago, just because something is likely true, that doesn't mean it is for certain true. And we have other options here that have to be discarded before we can assert for certain that he didn't study. Let me give you a few. First of all, Fishy himself has just admitted that evolution is complicated. There is a chance that Squirrel has tried to study evolution, has not really understood it, and then, based on his flawed understanding, has concluded that just makes no sense. This is garbage. In that case, he would have studied. Or, another option, Squirrel could have religiously studied every single argument made by other creationists. In that case, from his perspective, he would have felt like he did a lot of research. Now, we may not agree with his sources, but he would be under the impression that he did, in fact, study it. So if we were to tell him, hey, you didn't study, he would just, think we're full of it and not pay any attention. What would be much, much more helpful is to figure out what the hell he read, what the hell he learned, where he came up with his ideas. Squirrel also has previously mentioned that he hasn't seen evidence that the papers are trustworthy and unbiased. Now, unfortunately, he merely says papers, so that I don't even know for sure if he talks about newspapers and journals or actual research papers. That again would be something I would have to ask. So I can't really assume that either. But let's say if Squirrel read a research paper that said, steak is good for you because it contains stearic acid that could protect you from heart disease. And then a week later, he would read a research paper that says, steak is bad for you because it contains saturated fats and that can cause heart diseases. And then he might be confused, he might get suspicious and take everything, including evolution, with a fat pinch of salt. In fact, maybe he found contradictory research about evolution. And in that case, he would have studied. And us telling him that he didn't would not help whatsoever. And lastly, what if Squirrel actually believes in evolution? But he is aware that he doesn't know enough to hold a position with certainty. Many people believe that evolution is real because they're taught so in school, but they never actually get into details and they never get to study the why and the how. In that case, Fishy would be right that Squirrel didn't do much research. But all that Fishy would achieve by pointing that out is that maybe Squirrel shouldn't take evolution for granted. After all, if the teacher asserts it without evidence, then you get the point. Fishy also made a mistake by telling Squirrel that there is a lot of research and evidence, and by doing that, he just implied that evolution is proven. He made a positive claim in a post that tells you that you have to prove a positive and not a negative. And Squirrel picked right up on that.
Then you haven't studied it. Aside from the fact that not everyone has the time or required data to study everything evolution related, you mentioned yourself that it is very vast and complex. You linked a playlist that explains evolution, to that man's understanding, but he doesn't really reference all his sources, at least not to a degree where you could fact-check his claims in full. I would have to take him at his word, or, as many atheists would put it, on faith.
Cheeky Squirrel. Also, doesn't this guy sound a little sus?
On top of that, the presenter, Aaron Ra, is a man who has in the past written about boycotts against Target on his website and called them bigoted. I'd argue that's a very biased and uncharitable position, and makes me question his stance on other biological factors. In other words, I can't trust this man not to have a twisted perspective on evolution, since he already seems to have a twisted perspective on sex. Therefore, I can't in good conscience take his data at face value.
The argument Squirrel makes is very scruffy and badly chosen. Aaron Ra is very thorough and to the point in his explanation. And whatever political bias he might or might not have about people boycotting Target has nothing to do with the topic at hand. And it does not appear in his videos. At least not in this particular series. One could maybe argue that he might take things related to evolution for granted a bit because of his bias towards evolution, and that maybe could be an argument worth exploring. But that is not what Squirrel argues here. Squirrel argues politics. He is, however, right about the fact that Aaron Ra doesn't reference a lot of sources and research papers in his series. And if you think about it for a moment, that makes perfect sense. He can't just sit there and cross-reference everything he says. He can't be like, research paper A did this, research paper B said that, and research paper C shows us this, and if we combine that with the next 5,000 papers that I cite, then we will get to the conclusion that a particular fish could use his flippers to walk on land. That is not how that works. And so yes, Aaron Ra doesn't cite research, or rather, he doesn't always cite research. He doesn't offer the smackdown evidence for evolution that Squirrel here is looking for. He merely explains evolution. His series can be used to inform people who don't understand it. It cannot be used as evidence for people who are suspicious about it.
You are right. Proof of evolution is not as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. There is a great deal that goes into it, requiring hundreds, if not thousands of hours to research if you want to fully understand it all. And I, alas, do not have that amount of time. However, I can use a principle that you yourself propose. A positive claim has to be proven. Or, as this weird atheist YouTuber Logic tends to say, I put a to-do sticker on it and withhold judgment.
And another red flag for Squirrel. Not only does he seem to have a grasp on Aaron Ra's series and his website, but now he also quotes Logic. A very, very fishy squirrel, that Squirrel.
I think that I can reject evolution on the basis that I don't have the data / being shown the data needed to convince me. The same way you reject God. Would you agree that this is a logical approach?
Now Squirrel tries to pin Fishy down again. Do you agree that this is logical? And to be honest, that is utterly unnecessary right now. Fishy has already admitted that it is a logical conclusion. He merely claims that evolution is real and that Squirrel didn't do enough research. Which, it is off topic, and it is a bit an odd thing to throw out there, but it is not a negation of his other position. Let us see how Fishy responds to this.
I think I can reject evolution on the basis that I don't have the data / being shown the data needed to convince me. You have been shown. You just don't want to look at the facts.
Hold your horses there, Fishy. You are making unverified statements again, which is not good for you. You shouldn't do that. Who says that the Squirrel didn't look into it? Or didn't want to look? And what facts exactly are we talking about there, Fishy? You see, you have linked a series that informs us about systematic classification of life. It explains and describes evolution, at least for a great part, but it doesn't actually prove it. That is not the purpose of the series. If in my life I had never heard of evolution ever, and you were to come to me and send me this link, I would watch it. But I wouldn't just willy-nilly take it as evidence, take it for granted. I would take every single sentence and every claim he says and check it. And here is the why. Aaron Ra knows his sources, he knows the context, he knows how thorough he was, how honest he was, and so on. He knows it, but I do not. I am not him. For all I know, he could have pulled that stuff straight from a creationist website or any other obscure cavity that releases hot air and just chucked it in there. Of course, I highly doubt that he would, but how I feel about him is irrelevant. I either accept his claim on trust, or faith, as Squirrel would put it, or I check.
And as I said, there is far more facts that have been studied and measured with repeatable results from multiple different testers. Just because you refuse to look at this science doesn't make it false, it makes you willfully ignorant.
Fishy, you said that positive claims require evidence, and you argued for evolution. You made a positive claim. It is up to you to prove it to Squirrel, by your own standards. And what do you deliver? The Aaron Ra equivalent of Betty's diary talking about the butler's spontaneous combustion. Spiced with a bunch of snarky comments, of course. Why, Fishy? Why do you do that to yourself?
The same way you reject God, would you agree this is a logical approach? That's not the same way I lack belief in God. I have read the Bible, I have talked to Christians, I grew up with Christian parents and went to church every Sunday. I have talked to people of other religions, and none of them have facts supporting their supernatural claims that can be observed and measured with repeatable results from multiple different testers. That's the difference. Evolution can be observed and measured. Supernatural and God claims cannot. Therefore, I believe in evolution, but not God.
God damn it, Fishy! Squirrel is not you. If you have seen evidence, and you have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that evolution is real, then it makes sense for you to believe in evolution. But Squirrel has not seen what you have, not talked to the people you have talked to, and he does not have the evidence needed to come to the same conclusion as you did. And just to be clear, he could have exactly the same evidence that you do, exactly this to the dot, and still believe that it is wrong. And that has much more to do with trust than it has to do with the actual evidence. If the people you got the data from are people you trust, you're far more likely to take it by faith, which is very likely what you do day in, day out, because everyone does. And if you don't trust people, even if what they say is correct, you will still take it with a pinch of salt. And you talking about how you got evidence for evolution, but didn't get that sort of evidence for God, does not change that. Enough of my comments, let's see what Squirrel thinks of this.
You have been shown, you just don't want to look at the facts. I could use the exact same sentence referring to Jesus instead of evolution, and you deny that and claim there are flaws, that the source is bad, the data wrong, etc. You would be right to do so. You have not been shown proper evidence, whether your opponent says so or not. And in this scenario, I am in the same boat, just in relation to evolution, but you will not grant me that. You act like a religious person.
While I get the point Squirrel is trying to make, I don't know if I agree with the way he phrases it. Squirrel has no idea what Fishy has or has not been shown. The point makes sense, he is basically equating his experience to Fishy's, and points out that it's very subjective all in all. You saw this evidence, and it wasn't proper evidence. I have seen evidence, and it wasn't proper evidence, and yeah, except no. If you talk to people who changed or lost their faith, then the one thing that you will find time and time again is that they hold their new worldview to a higher standard than their old one, regardless of whether that sentiment is valid or not. That is not an absolute, of course, but it is fairly common, and it also makes sense if you think about it. Changing your worldview can be very costly. You could lose friends, you could lose family, you could lose your job. So the new one better be worth it. The new one better be better. And so if you have an atheist who, for example, gets converted into a religion, he might end up looking down to other atheists and their beliefs. And the same is true the other way around. When a believer leaves the religion, he will look down to his former belief. So trying to equate the non-belief in evolution to the non-belief in Jesus will often not be seen as a valid comparison, even if you set up a hypothetical scenario in which they might be. And Squirrel does it twice. Once with, why can't I reject this if you can reject that? And the second time when talking about attitude. You act like a religious person. And I mean, I can't really argue against Squirrel there because Fishy did argue like a religious person, but at the same time, it's just not helpful in this moment right now, Squirrel.
On top of that, I have not said evolution is right or wrong. I've said nothing about the validity of evolution at all, in fact, nor my belief. All I've said is that I wasn't shown enough evidence. There are many people believing in evolution who haven't seen a lot of evidence, just like there are a lot of people who believe in God without looking into it. Please, be more careful and don't jump to conclusions. All I did was 1. Applying your premise to evolution, and 2. Setting the perfectly feasible restrictions of an average working adult, where, due to said restrictions, the person has to resort to a method, your method, rather than infinite data.
This part I like a lot actually. Squirrel here seems to notice that his argument from before wasn't clear, or not clear enough. And so he tries to rephrase it. That is actually a very good approach. If you notice that what you said is not clear, putting it differently might actually get it across. I remember having had a similar problem several years ago during a debate. The person I was debating against kept telling me that his book is the truth and no other religious book would be. And I kept trying to find out how I could figure that out, how I could know that that would be true. Or rather, what sort of a criteria I could possibly use, what kind of standard, to establish that his holy book is accurate, but the stuff in the Quran is not. And he kept repeating that the Bible is accurate, and I can just ask, and clearly the Quran is not. And it took me quite a while to understand that the problem wasn't that he avoided the answer, or that I didn't understand what he tried to answer with, but that instead he just didn't understand my question. It was a good lesson. I really enjoyed that discussion. He was a very nice guy too.
I also gave good reasons for being suspicious about the person you linked. Aaron Ra is biased. To give you a less loaded example, look up the video Logic made about a physicist, Claudia Albers. She has a doctorate in physics, taught in a university in South Africa, and believed kangaroos are aliens. If I would know Albers believed in alien kangaroos, among other things, I would be justified in being suspicious about her other claims and verifying them. It is perfectly logical to be careful about claims of a person who has already shown bias.
Oh man. That flag is so red that it bleeds through the screen. Squirrel.
I am Dr. Claudia Albers, Planet X research and professional physicist.
Now, as mentioned before, I don't think that Squirrel has a good argument about Aaron Ra. And on top of that, it's a really stupid idea to determine the validity of a claim based on who says it, rather than on its own merits. You have a greater chance that someone who studied medicine may know more about a sickness than someone who didn't, but you can't blindly accept what the doctor says, nor can you blindly discard what a non-doctor says, especially if the non-doctor has solid evidence to back him up and a good track record of being right several times over. We should always focus on what is said, and we should always focus on what is given to us to back it up, and we should very rarely focus on who actually says it. This back and forth is great. It makes me want to grab some popcorn. This is amazing.
I have applied your reasoning to a subject you believe in, and my hope was that you would be consistent in saying, if you have no ability to research or fact check something, then by default you shouldn't blindly believe it, whether that is ghosts, gods, or evolution. But instead, you switch to a standard holier-than-thou approach, and accuse the other person of basically being disingenuous. I'm sorry, but unless you are consistent in your approach and think things through, you are as hypocritical as the believers you argue against.
Once again, I think Squirrel here is off. Fishy was consistent. He said, yes, Squirrel should not believe in evolution if he lacks the evidence. He merely accused Squirrel of not studying enough. That's a different story. He didn't say, you can reject all positive claims without evidence except of Santa. He said you can reject all positive claims without evidence, including Santa, but if you don't believe in Santa, you are just stupid and super stupid and uninformed and stubborn, and how can you not understand that there is a Santa when I even sent you his address from the North Pole? Still ridiculous, mind you, but not inconsistent. He also didn't say that Squirrel is disingenuous, or overtly implied it. Telling you that you don't want to research in the context of this discussion is not the same as calling you disingenuous. It is merely a stupid assertion that Fishy made based on flawed assumptions. And probably based on a lack of attention, because clearly Squirrel went to sift around Aaron Ra's website, if he didn't already know about it. Stupid to say, but disingenuous it is not.
I could use the exact same sentence referring to Jesus instead of evolution. Anticipated, already countered. That's precisely why I said that evolution is observable and measurable with repeatable results, whereas the claims of the supernatural or of God are not.
Fishy, you're not paying attention. Squirrel said in the very same comment that, quote, I've said nothing about the validity of evolution at all, in fact, or my belief. All I've said is that I wasn't shown enough evidence, end quote. He is not telling you that Jesus is an equally valid proposition as evolution. His argument clearly doesn't give a fuck about validity or belief. All he seems to care about is that you understand and concede that not everyone who studies a subject comes to the same conclusion as you do.
Aaron Ra is not the source. He is merely demonstrating the facts.
Yes, Fishy. Aaron Ra is indeed not the source of evolution or the systematic classification of life. He merely demonstrates it. He presents it like a... What did Squirrel call him? Oh yes, a presenter. And you know what else Squirrel said? He said, quote, you linked a playlist that explains evolution, to that man's understanding, but he doesn't really reference all his sources, end quote. Squirrel asked you for the sources, for the evidence, for the thing that you yourself claimed is up to you to provide to him.
You are free to look up those facts yourself and verify them, unlike God, whom I cannot look up and see if he is real. Hence, my religion is called faith.
Uh-huh. So now it's suddenly up to Squirrel to look it up, is it? To find the evidence, to prove your positive point to himself instead of you proving it to him, even though your post says that that's your job? Very convenient, isn't it?
That, you would be consistent and say, I have remained consistent. If you have no ability to research or fact check something, then by default you shouldn't blindly believe it. I agree with this. However, you have the entire world's knowledge at your fingertips, which means you do have the ability to research and fact check evolution. You just don't want to. At least, not the time it would take to have it explained to you.
But, don't you understand? He's right there. He's right there in your chat, asking you for proof and taking the time to read your comments. A
starving man begging for a cup of truth, and you have nothing to offer me?
How cruel of you.
But instead you switch to a standard holier-than-thou approach, and accuse the other person of basically being disingenuous. What are you talking about? Me saying you're disingenuous? Well, you admitted yourself that you don't want to put in the time necessary to prove evolution to your standards because it would take too long. It's like saying you don't believe in calculus because you have never seen evidence proving it, and you don't want to learn it either. That's how silly you are.
But Fishy, he came to you. He asked you to give him the evidence after you claimed that evolution was proven. He did everything you told him to do, and you did not deliver. Alright, enough messing around. Let's get serious for a moment. What stuck out to me the most was how much we got to know about Fishy and how little we actually know about Squirrel. In debates and discussions, it is often better to share as little as possible about yourself as you can and to pay very close attention to what the other person says. Like with the police, everything you say can and will be used against you, so the less you say and the better you phrase it, the better it is for you. On the other hand, the more the other person talks and the less the person pays attention to what is said, the easier it will be for you to pick up on inconsistencies. It is also a good idea to not reply right away. It is good to read through things twice or 3 times, make sure you actually understand what is being said, make sure you didn't miss anything weird, something hidden perhaps, and sometimes maybe just ponder a bit and try to find out if the way you interpreted it is correct or might not be. Taking your time also helps with emotions. If something upsets you, you're far more prone to making mistakes if you reply right away. Whereas if you chill a bit, you might have a clearer head and a better response. The best strategy by far, however, is to find flaws in your own thinking before you post anything. If you manage to find flaws and holes in your own arguments, you will be able to correct them, and you will have far better and far more polished arguments when you're actually using them to discuss with others. And for Fishy personally, I have one more advice. Don't copy the Titans, don't pick up catchy comebacks and witty one-liners that have been spoken a billion times before, don't adopt bad ideas just to appease your group, and don't take anything for granted. Instead, do your own thing, develop your own arguments, discover your own way to be, and be you. And most importantly, good scrub. I wish you all the best. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, give it a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and don't forget to scold me in the comment section below. And thank you to the wonderful people who are supporting me. You're awesome, and have a great evening.